Hello, everybody. Thanks for letting us interrupt you in the middle of the workday. You've just gotten an alert that Jules is going live, and if you're catching up by the wisdom of the LinkedIn algorithm after, hope you'll stay with us. We'll probably be on for about a half an hour, and I think something super relevant to privacy practitioners, data protection folks, regulators, and everybody who's trying to have a thoughtful frame of reference on the incredible changes happening at the intersection of data and technology. I'm really happy to have one of my personal heroes, one of the books I keep nearby, which if you haven't read, I will tell you, I walked into the office today. Most of the staff are not here. We had our annual meeting, so about 100 or so of our stakeholders, corporate, academic, civil society, spent the last 2 days chatting, and we left the interns in the office alone. So I came back expecting to see it, trashed. It was not. But I said to them, hey, I need our copy of Privacy in Context. And they looked at me and they were like, what? And I'm like, wait a second, you are, most of them, law grads, and you're all eager to start a career. And it wasn't, they were like, oh yeah. And I'm like, you know what? There's something missing in the, and these folks haven't necessarily studied privacy undergrad, right? They're law students. They want to do something in privacy. This may be their first exposure, but I put it at the top of our reading list for students. And I really wanted to talk to Helen and Yan today, because I feel like the buzzwords of the day have sort of overshadowed what is actually been for a long time one of the core, drivers under a lot of very thoughtful, practical and philosophical thinking. So we this is sort of a reminder, and I want you to hear directly from some of the leaders in the field. Today, everyone is talking about surveillance capitalism and dark patterns and algorithmic audits, and useful to step back just for a second to actually understand really what some of the deeper moral undercurrents are that are solutions for really thinking in a thoughtful way. Ina Barmash, a longtime GC and senior CPO, in the comments notes that Helen's writing was important for shaping my understanding of privacy work as a baby lawyer. So, and she thinks it should be indeed required reading. So in the academic world, we've certainly seen a huge amount of scholarship building on Helen's work. And we just want to kind of flag to those of you who watched the hearing, yesterday, that there are some core concepts here that can help provide answers that are very, very practical. Okay, I'm going to let Helen and Yan introduce themselves. I was mentioning to Yan that I introduced somebody the other day, and I said, oh, they're from Yale University or Duke University. And they got very offended because they're at the such and such school where they're the co-director of this lab, and they have a joint appointment in there. And this was like putting them on the wrong sports team. So Helen, you are now at Cornell Tech, but please give a little more of the shaping and properly set up what our audience ought to know, other than that you are my queen of philosophers and maybe one of the founding modern philosophers of privacy. But what keeps you employed on a day-to-day basis? We are.
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me and Yan to this discussion. Look forward to it. As you mentioned, I'm at Cornell Tech, and for those who are not familiar, Cornell Tech is a campus or a school of Cornell University, but we exist on Roosevelt Island, and many people who've lived in New York their whole lives aren't aware of Roosevelt Island. This is a brand new campus, and it's mostly computer engineering, computer science, electrical engineering, and I'm in the information science department, and I also run something. I'm the director of the Digital Life Initiative, which looks at ethics, politics, and quality of life in digital societies.
And Yan.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Jules, for inviting me and being on the panel with Helen is always Always great. So my name is Yan Shvartzshnaider. I'm at Lassonde School of Engineering at York University in Canada. This University of York, which is in UK, but York University in Canada. And then I'm also the director of the Privacy Rhythm Lab at York. So where we are essentially trying to work with Helen and other colleagues on integrating contextual integrity in computer systems and understanding societal norms and how they can be aligned with those. So great pleasure, and hopefully we'll have a great discussion.
Okay. So Helen, I'm almost embarrassed that, when I first started out in privacy, I sat down with, somebody who sort of was one of the kind of architects of, cookies and basic infrastructure. And he was teaching me, I was coming out of government and politics, sort of like an internet 101. And it was like, as if I was asking Albert Einstein, like, can you teach me how to divide or do math or, or the like. So I'm embarrassed, but I'm going to ask you to share, because I think in our audience, we've got, from senior data protection folks to perhaps, some baby lawyers who kind of get, oh, of course, out of context means you might have a privacy problem, but the deeper structure that you've built around it, can you give us a minute or two of sort of 101 that gives some understanding of the complexity? And then please, people, go out and buy the book. And then maybe I'll even ask Yan or you to recommend. There's been so much useful follow-up work that has shown how rich the application can be. It might be even interesting to point people to some of the layers of thought that you and others have built on this framework.
Yeah, sure. And I want to say, Jules, that in fact, it was one of the earlier conversations that I had with you that actually pushed me to think about, okay, it's all very well. I'm a philosopher. I have a PhD in philosophy. I've developed a philosophical theory of privacy. And you were one of those people who said, yeah, but, so what? Like, tell us how it might change how we do things in the world with regard to regulation or technology design. And so that really did push me to think about how to describe the theory to folks who do have those capabilities, which go well beyond mine. So recently I've been expressing or describing contextual integrity in a few key ideas, and they all build on one another. The first key idea, and by the way, at some point, I'm happy to, you might say, okay, this is contextual integrity. How is it similar or different from some of the dominant ways that people generally understand privacy and right to privacy? The first key idea is that privacy is about appropriate flow of information. So it's not about secrecy. Some computer scientists would say, oh, you've got less privacy because some information about you has gotten out into the world. That's not the way we think about it. We think flow of information can be really good, is really good. It's not a compromise for information to flow. It's just that it must be appropriate. And then the rest of the theory tries to explain what we mean by appropriate. And the way we get there is to think about the world or society not in this undifferentiated space, but rather society as actually we live it, which is divided into social spheres. Nothing mysterious about this. Medicine, healthcare and medicine, education, commerce, finance, and so forth. And that these spheres, within these spheres, there are rules or norms of how information should flow. And when you express these norms, and this gets a little bit technical, you need to give values for 5 variables or 5 parameters. And this is where my computer science friends come in, because they figure out how to express these. So really the beginning of contextual integrity is this idea of appropriate flow.
I see in our comments a good friend, Britton Heller, who you may know. Recently, Britton has been spending lots of time on metaverse issues, where she's been a critic and a commentator and an expert. She's at Yale, currently worked at the ADL, and she's been doing some thinking about neuro rights and mental privacy.
Yes.
It says that many of the proponents of neuro rights are excited about privacy in context, which I wasn't aware of. Were you aware of it? And any sort of obvious driving reasons why this is such a compelling, relevant for neuro rights and mental privacy, given the fact that there are already controllers that we can see, Facebook and others proposing to use with your hand, just moving your hand and detecting the nerves. FPF and IBM did a paper on flagging some of the basic emerging issues around neuro concerns and privacy.
Mm-hmm.
But Helen, neuro privacy in context and neuro rights and mental privacy.
Yeah, well, like, way to go to the hardest questions first.
That's your fault, but she,
Okay.
but
Okay.
wow,
Yes.
that's what's on people's minds.
Yes. No, I mean, I always will fall back to this idea that the reason for these 5 parameters is to be less absolutist about secrecy. We don't defend no flow of information, although it's possible that there's certain circumstances in which we just simply say nobody should have access to certain kinds of information. But in this case, it may be that some parties, it's appropriate for this information about you. And again, like, what is this information? I actually have a student who's working on a project on brain-machine interface and how concerning it is. So we need to, if we accept that this is a useful thing for society to be doing, to explore like the synapse between brain and machine, then we need to stipulate what rules should be, because this wasn't possible before. And so who should have access to this kind of information, and what should the rules be? So Hippocrates knew thousands of years ago that he was entering into homes and seeing certain information, but he needed that to treat people. And therefore, you need to develop the rules. Who gets it? How, under what constraints, what should the rules be, what type of information, and so forth.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I can see we've been already thinking about eye tracking in a significant way, not neural rights, obviously, but intimate in many ways. And I think developers in the immersive technology world are deeply excited about the advances that are being made, so that data which today is locked in your computer, locked in a phone. I'm navigating. Why am I looking down at a phone when I'm navigating, when there may be better ways to see directions or get a search or get information, and whether it's voice or whether it's rendering something in my field of vision appropriately, somebody is going to be looking at my eyes and what I'm looking at. And I obviously will want that working well if it's a matter of rendering information for me properly. And then you can see a whole bunch of other not so clearly contextual uses that may or may not violate some of these norms, some which might be advertising, which clearly some will argue violates a certain norm. And then there may be lots of intermediate things like making this work better for different color eyes and different shapes of people and different colors of skin, which might be somewhat adjacent, but might be in the context of what a good expectation is. Let me ask Yan to jump in and just maybe talk a little bit about sort of how your work and some of the other sort of next generation of academics have found this field so sort of rich for further, building for theses, for papers and thought. And we don't have your sound.
I'm muted again. Okay, sorry. Okay. Saying that at some point I should probably write a book on my journey, because it was quite a journey to get from, I'm a computer scientist. I was working with Internet of Things for a while, coming from lower levels of systems and networking, and this notion of flow of information is natural to me. So when I kind of encountered contextual integrity and started looking at it, it made sense to me straight away, which actually made it quite useful for me as a computer scientist to talk about the systems that I'm trying to build, and also talk to people that are actually dealing with policy and governance, and essentially build research around it. And this is such a great thing to have a common language to describe your ideas from fairly technical level, but also go up level and look at applications and policy and so forth. So part of this discussion and part of this work actually led to us co-organizing with Helen Nissenbaum from University of Chicago symposium on application of contextual integrity that brings together all those communities. And in fact, I'll tell you that, well, at least one of the submission actually talks about the use of contextual integrity of analyzing mental health, privacy, and so forth. So I encourage all the listeners and viewers to check it out, to join us. But overall, it was very rewarding to use contextual integrity, because it kind of opened up my view on what privacy is when it's embedded in my system. When we build a system as computer scientists, we have a particular, as you mentioned, and Helen also said that, secrecy or anonymous data or things like that essentially on device only, and things like that essentially we can call them privacy friendly, but really the notion of privacy and what it means for societal, how it affects societal norms and expectations is not embedded in our thinking at the start. And I think having this kind of discussion and using a framework like contextual integrity provides those opportunities to essentially educate. Well, as I'm not preaching, I was there myself, educate myself in understanding that there are bigger implications of what we actually do, and we have bigger responsibility. And I try to now teach it in my course as well, understanding that, as computer scientists, engineers, we have, greater responsibilities, and having a common language to talk to other people from philosophy, information scientists, and work together, as we've done, was a great journey, and I'm looking forward to what comes next.
And let's make another comment about the conference, because we didn't tell people at the top, so let's remind them now, and our folks will post it in the comments. You and colleagues are hosting what I'll call an academic conference, but with a very welcome, open invitation to engaging lawyers, privacy practitioners, CPOs, others in this conversation. It's the formal title of the conference, and when and where is?
So it's a fourth annual symposium on application of contextual integrity. So we had quite a few iterations of that, and we bring it at home to DLI. So it's going to be on the Roosevelt Island, so people should come and join and see. It's a beautiful place. It's going to be on September 22nd, 23rd, so 1.5 day, close to 2 of discussions. Actually, it's important to note that if you would like to submit something to the symposium, we have a range of options, quite open for mature work, for ongoing work, for policy ideas, and so forth. The deadline for submission of intent is tomorrow, and then you can, the final submission is in a week, so June 24th. So, as Jules said, we're really welcoming everyone who's interested in contextual integrity, working on contextual integrity, and please follow up if you need more information. So yeah, it's going to be great. We had a lot of fun in previous years, and it's growing, so it's great to see so much interest in the theory and application.
Can I just jump in a little bit, Jules, because I wanted to take some of the comments you'd said about eye tracking and the kind of work that Yan is doing to explain that there's an aspect of contextual integrity that's a little bit harder, but it's as important than the formal rendering of it. So, for example, when you were talking about eye tracking, a lot of people would immediately go to a solution, and they would say, well, we just have to get people's permission, and then it's okay to do the eye tracking. Or whatever it is that's being done, We just have to, and the way we do it is, generally speaking, but this isn't we have a privacy policy, we tell them, they agree, we can improve the situation. But the work that contextual integrity directs us to is not about getting individuals' consent for this or that or the other thing. It's so, for example, Yan has now become an expert at human subject studies, asking people their input. But we're different from a lot of studies. We don't say, what do you want? Is it okay for you? What we say, we ask about what people expect, because we want to understand how people understand the norms. And as you know, and any lawyer here knows, expectation is built into this idea of privacy, reasonable expectation of privacy. However, with things like eye tracking or mental privacy, it's so maybe beyond we don't know what to expect. Contextual integrity then asks us to analyze data flows in terms of who's harmed, who benefits. That is the context. Are the aims of the context, let's say healthcare, are they promoted by this particular information flow? So instead of asking constantly, like, is it okay? Would you agree? Blah, blah, blah. We want people to think about, how do the data flows affect society? Who are the winners and losers on average? How does it affect some of our values? You mentioned fairness and equity. If some information flows, does that allow people to be discriminated against? And if that's the case, maybe we should have constraints on those flows. So it really opens up a different way to think about privacy.
We had a furious debate at dinner last night at a table that had a real diverse set of participants. And one person said, these legislative proposals that just sort of ban or restrict or really make it hard take individual autonomy away when you don't even let me ask for consent, or where you say consent really needs these constraints because we have to question whether it's given freely and so forth. You're taking individual autonomy away. And the critic who really came back at him hard, who happened to be a person of color, said, let me tell you that, asking for consent when you're talking about a community where people, because of history or conditions or other challenges, are going to end up ticking a decision, even if it's, tick, tick, tick. We need to bring a greater sense of value and context and understanding because of the broader equity concerns. And it really helped, I think, explain why, and this person was a data protection officer at a, big retailer, but brought a certain background, to it, where he didn't see it as taking away autonomy if he wasn't going to be able to ask, because he understood that there was a societal framing in it.
Well, because I want to address this question of autonomy. Autonomy isn't expressing desire or preference. Autonomy is a more general notion. And if I ask your permission, say, to track your eyes, and you say yes, and you don't know what the implications are of that, you haven't really you haven't given someone the ability to exercise autonomy, because maybe the consequence of that runs counter to people's larger interests. And when we talk about autonomy, we're not talking about just like, yeah, I like vanilla and you like chocolate. They're much more complex ideas. Second of all, one person can have an effect on someone else's information. And we've seen this in genetic privacy as well. So we really have to think with more of a societal lens when we think about privacy. Okay, sorry, I think you were trying to say something. I'll hand back.
Let me bring in a question from Kent Bai. Says Meta has spoken about their desire to create contextually aware AI, which seems to want to map out all aspects of our contexts. Can you speak about how you could apply contextual integrity frameworks to an AI system which aims to be persistently aware of all contexts? Guess, yeah, I don't know what to go with that. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, so I'll say this, and also I'm going to ask Yan to weigh in. The term context is extremely generic. And now, I've often said, oh, I regret using that term. We use, and I have an article that's downloadable for free from my website. It's like, what is context? What isn't it? For purposes of privacy, when we talk about context, we mean social domain. When I don't know what Meta means by context, but they could mean things like, is it night or day? Are we inside or outside? How many people in the room? Context could be all sorts of factors, but it need not be context in a way that's relevant to one's expectations of privacy. So, I mean, Yan, we've wanted to use machine learning to learn context in this deeper way. Yeah.
It's a great discussion point to have, at the symposium. But we have tried a few things in terms of, so contextual integrity, when it comes to this kind of questions, can be taken as, okay, it's just 5 parameters, so Meta will just collect all of those and it has it and make a decision. But it's a simple but not a trivial framework to analyze and discuss those matters. And there's a lot of questions here. What is context? What is actually AI? And what exactly is happening? And we have tried to understand those from the spec that usually provided with those systems. And usually, to some degree, they're not thinking, so it's kind of unfair comparison because they're not thinking in terms of contextual integrity when they say context oriented or so they're not actually thinking in those terms. They just use the word context because somehow people associate that with it's going to be restricted to some certain things and not going to be broad. But if you look inside, they actually they don't have a good definition of any notion of what context is. So it's very hard to comment on that. But certainly when those systems are integrated into our, creating those systems in our daily lives can certainly affect some of the and disrupt some of the expectations they might have. And I think what we argue for is essentially we need to find a way to, rather than have, as somebody said at some point, it's not about control, it's about respect, right? So it's not trying to provide tons of settings and saying, hey, we can do all of those things and you control what AI can do. It's about understanding that each context societal sphere has its own purposes, values, and you have to respect those. And if you integrate a new system, you should actually understand what people's expectations are and how would you build a system around it. So at first, as a default, it will respect those. And then once you have a good way of understanding kind of sense, pulse, and understanding what's actually going on, how people might align themselves with the new system, might proceed. And I just one comment on contextual integrity. A lot of the time people kind of go through a few pages of the book or read a couple of papers that use contextual integrity as a summary, and they miss out on this heuristic that essentially is quite powerful, that essentially allows for, so whenever there's a deviation of the flow from the expectation, contextual integrity doesn't say that there is a violation of privacy. It's a potential, right? So the idea there is a deviation. Why? What are the purpose of this deviation? What we can achieve with that? And we can actually align ourselves. And that's actually quite powerful when you build new systems and essentially creating new environments where can you understand what can be done in such a way.
I want to leave people with a little taste of perhaps your thoughts of how CI may be the place they ought to be looking on what is hottest issue in legislation today. The bills that are being proposed,
Yes.
both the so-called Three Corners bill that leaders in Congress are behind, Senator Cantwell's bill, AI regulatory efforts in Europe. Everybody wants algorithmic assessments, algorithmic audits, and nobody really has a good sense. Mostly people are focused on, is there particular bias against a certain protected class or a certain high risk of activity? And it seems to me that there's a real rich look. If I'm building an AI audit and I have a chance to start this new thing from scratch and maybe do something better than simply looking at the DPIAs that people are doing in a very rote way sometimes to kind of tick boxes under the GDPR, the critique from many of our colleagues who do those is they feel they're doing a tick box exercise as opposed to, am I actually responding to something that's going to protect users or flag risks and show what is a high risk and what is a low risk. So thoughts on sort of the up, or has anyone done in people who've been building around CI relevant work that could really inform? We just had our annual meeting. I must have had a dozen people say, I get that I'm going to have to do some sort of AI audit. I have no clue. Help build what that is. Where and how would you kind of have CI frame this? It seems obvious that it's an obvious place to start.
You've gone in two different directions, and I want to keep them a little bit separate. I know that there've been a lot of privacy bills at the state level, and currently I think there's one in front of Congress. I haven't kept up to them. I've looked at some, like because I live in New Jersey most of the time, I had studied the New Jersey proposal, and I have briefed. So I don't have the details. I'm not optimistic about omnibus privacy bills as a total solution to the privacy conundrum, because they first of all, they too heavily rely on consent. So whatever they say, do this, do that, unless you can get consent. Once you have that get out of jail free card, you have infinitely weakened the privacy constraints you've imposed. We need, in addition to the privacy omnibus, I'm calling it an omnibus, the way the GDPR has an omnibus, and they're very much couched in the Code of Fair Information Practice Principles. I think that code, forgive me, is outdated. It was written in the 1970s. We are so far from that to continue to push that framework in privacy legislation is doomed. So I would like to see some kind of omnibus approach coupled with a sectoral approach, and not the current sectoral approach, because the current sectoral approach is full of holes. HIPAA, FERPA, and Gramm-Leach-Bliley, all of these sectoral approaches, it's very easy to dodge them by the tech industry. So that's one area where I have some views about legislation. The AI discussions and algorithmic accountability and algorithmic fairness and opacity and transparency, I think we'll have to come back, Jules, to another discussion. I can just say that we recently, and we will be presenting a paper at the FACT conference, which is where it's now the huge conference of fairness and accountability. We have an article, myself and a postdoc and some PhD students, on accountability in an algorithmic society, in which it sort of updates an ancient paper that I wrote, Accountability in a computerized society, but now we're looking at algorithmic societies and saying, how do we achieve accountability and what are the challenges to that? But it's quite a large discussion.
thank you for joining me. Let's remind people again that they can hear a lot more and raise some of these questions and participate as well. Please take a look at the comments for details about the upcoming 4th annual conference focused on contextual integrity. I'm honored to have Helen Nissenbaum and Yan Shvartzshnaider with me today. Please do show up in New York. If, like me, you're a long time, once upon a time New Yorker who never took the tram over the island during.
Beautiful.
You know what? I was over there once. I was it's Consumer Affairs Commissioner of New York City, and we used to hold town hall meetings somewhere. And we did hold one on Roosevelt Island. So I was on the island at that point, but it may have changed in the 20 years since I was in.
Well, it's changed. You can take the ferry too for $2.75.
All right, I've got to squeeze in one quick question from Britton Heller, because she's fabulous and thinking hard about these things. And then we will let folks go to their day. She says, should CI be included in human rights impact assessments that tech companies commission, or is that outside scope? Because indeed, those are very often very heavily consent-based. Maybe that starts to answer the question, but your thoughts?
I mean, when we're talking about human rights, we're focusing on the individual. And one of the key elements of contextual integrity is to look at the societal impacts of certain data flows. However, when we think about the impacts of a certain data flow, it could be a disruptive data flow, IoT, neural, mental privacy, and so on. There are impacts on individuals as well. And so I would love to think that when we say privacy as a human right, instead of, when we say privacy, we mean appropriate flow as a human right, because that has impacts on quality of life, human freedom, autonomy, and so forth. So the answer is yes.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me. Happy Thursday, everybody, and look forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Well.
Bye.
All right.